The war had raged for centuries. Across the known galaxy, the Varash Dominion reigned supreme, a brutal empire forged in conquest and maintained through overwhelming military force. Its fleets crushed entire star systems without mercy, erasing civilizations that dared to resist their rule. The Dominion's war doctrine was simple: annihilation first, diplomacy never. Humanity had been a footnote in their long history of extermination. When the Dominion first encountered them centuries ago, humans were seen as nothing more than a minor nuisance, a species too weak and too insignificant to warrant serious attention. Their primitive fleets had been burned from the skies, their colonies reduced to ruin, and their presence in the galaxy all but erased. The Dominion never questioned the completeness of their victory, but they had made a mistake. And now, that mistake was coming back to haunt them. A galaxy-wide spectacle, the final human stronghold lay under siege. A last remaining outpost, a cluster of defiant colonies that had somehow survived the Dominion's purges. It should have been impossible for them to endure this long. But against all logic, they had resisted. And now, with their backs against the wall, the Dominion's admirals prepared to end them once and for all. The Dominion's fleet hung in high orbit over the planet like a sky choked with storm clouds. Thousands of warships, ranging from swift attack frigates to massive dreadnoughts, maintained their positions in a flawless siege formation. Their weapons were primed, their orders absolute. This would not be a battle. It would be an execution. Admiral Torin Val Korash, one of the Dominion's most decorated warlords, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Tarkashan, a colossal battleship outfitted with enough firepower to turn entire continents to ash. His red-hued eyes gleamed with the certainty of victory as he surveyed the tactical display before him. The humans would send a desperate fleet. They had no other choice. They would throw every last warship, every last fighter, every last ounce of resistance at the Dominion's blockade. It would be an act of defiance, a doomed struggle against impossible odds. Torin had already planned out the engagement. First, the human ships would arrive in formation, hoping to break through the Dominion's lines. Second, the Dominion's superior numbers would shatter them within minutes. And third, the remnants would be hunted down and eliminated, ending humanity's presence in the galaxy forever. It would be over in an hour. But then, something unexpected happened. A single contact appeared on the Dominion's long-range scanners. One. Not an armada. Not a battle group, just one. A single warship, closing in on the Dominion's blockade at impossible speed. The bridge fell into silence. Torin narrowed his gaze at the display, expecting it to be some kind of malfunction. Perhaps a scouting vessel, a lost freighter, or maybe a human transmission ship arriving to beg for terms. But no. This ship was not broadcasting any distress signals. It was not hailing for negotiations. It was coming straight for them. A ghost in the void. "Scan that ship," Torin ordered, his voice like grinding metal. The officers around him moved quickly, their hands dancing across control panels as they attempted to analyze the incoming vessel. The Dominion's fleet had cataloged every known human warship. They knew their designs, their weaponry, their formations. The humans were nothing if not predictable, but then the results came in, and nothing made sense. "Sir." One of the bridge officers hesitated, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty. We can't get a full reading," Torin's brow furrowed. "Explain. The ship's hull composition is unknown. It's not made from any human alloys on record, and its energy signatures—" The officer's fingers flicked over the interface, recalibrating the sensors, running the scans again. "They don't match any known human power cores. Sir, it's moving too fast for standard human drives." Torin's irritation deepened. That was impossible. Humanity's technology was generations behind the Dominion. Their warships were outdated, crude, cobbled together in desperation. They had never fielded anything that could match Dominion engineering, let alone surpass it. So how was this one ship moving through the void like a phantom? It was as if the universe itself refused to acknowledge its presence. The order to destroy a heavy silence settled over the bridge. Then, Torin exhaled sharply, dismissing the creeping unease. It didn't matter what one ship was. This was still a battle of numbers. "Destroy it," he ordered. the response was immediate. Across the Dominion's blockade, a wall of firepower erupted. Thousands of plasma lances, railgun rounds, and missile barrages screamed through the void, converging on the lone human warship. The space between them became a raging storm of death, a killing field from which nothing could escape. No ship, no matter how advanced, could withstand that. And yet, the human warship did not die. An impossibility unfolds. At first, the Dominions. Officers assumed their weapons had connected, that the human ship had been obliterated instantly. But as the smoke cleared, the readings remained the same. The ship was still there. It had not dodged. It had not raised shields. Instead, it had moved through the firestorm with an eerie, calculated precision. Not weaving erratically like a desperate pilot, not scrambling for cover like a fragile warship, but gliding through kill zones as if the Dominion's entire armada was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. And then, it fired back. Not with conventional human weapons. Not with crude missiles or outdated cannons. A pulse of light erupted from the ship's core. Not energy, not matter, but something in between. It lashed out into the battlefield faster than light itself, a distortion of reality that made even the most advanced Dominion sensors lag behind. The shot did not strike a Dominion vessel. Instead, it detonated in open space, seemingly harmless. For a fraction of a second, the bridge of the Tarkashan was silent. Then, systems began to fail. Across the Dominion fleet, chaos erupted, shields flickered, weapons powered down, entire capital ships lost control of their engines. The Dominion's precision targeting arrays collapsed into static. Their advanced fire control systems reduced to dead weight. A low hum resonated through the fleet, something ancient and terrible, as if the universe itself had shifted around them. And in that moment, every Dominion officer understood. They were not hunting this ship. It had hunted them, and the Resolute had arrived. A creeping unease spread through the Dominion fleet. It started as confusion, momentary lapses in targeting systems, power fluctuations too small to be considered malfunctions. But those moments grew longer. The malfunctions deepened. And then, in the span of a breath, control was slipping from their hands. Admiral Torin Valcourache watched it all unfold from the command deck of the Tarkashan, his flagship looming over the battle like a god of war. But for the first time in his long, blood-stained career, he was not in control. The human warship had done something to them, something no fleet in the history of the Dominion had ever accomplished. And it had done so without firing a single conventional shot. The Dominion's crumbling supremacy report. Torin's voice cracked through the command deck, his sharp bark slicing through the rising panic of his officers. The bridge was a chaotic storm of voices. Status displays flickered, war consoles pulsed with emergency warnings, and Dominion engineers furiously worked to reboot systems that should have been invulnerable. "Shields are destabilizing across the fleet," one of the officers shouted. "Weapons are offline, sir," another barked. "Railgun capacitors are failing to charge. Engines on 6 capital ships are... Sir, they're completely unresponsive. Torin's..." Crimson eyes burned as he turned toward the tactical display. The Dominion's thousands of warships, an armada vast enough to crush civilizations, were frozen in place, paralyzed by an enemy they hadn't even begun to understand. And the human ship? It had not slowed. It glided through the battlefield with an eerie, predatory grace. Silent, calculating, a specter among the stars. The Admiral clenched his fists. This wasn't possible. No technology in the galaxy could bypass the Dominion's defenses like this. No weapon existed that could disable an entire fleet without even making direct contact. And yet, there it was. Undeniable. Unstoppable. Unfathomable. An incomprehensible power. The warship was unlike anything the Dominion had ever encountered. It did not resemble the crude, industrial designs of old human vessels. There were no exposed weapons. No obvious thruster ports, no heat signatures that aligned with any known human propulsion system. Its hull, a deep, matte black that seemed to swallow the light around it, was unmarred, untouched by the immense firepower the Dominion had unleashed upon it. It bore no insignias, no markings, no battle scars. It did not look like a warship. It looked like something else entirely. And that was the most terrifying part. Admiral. The sensor officer's voice was quieter now, no longer filled with the certainty of Dominion superiority. It wavered with something else. Fear. Torin turned his gaze toward him, his jaw tightening. What is it? The officer hesitated. Sir, it's still not transmitting any identification codes. Not on any Dominion channels. Not even on known human frequencies. Torin exhaled sharply. You're saying this ship is… what? A ghost? A rogue? Fleet prototype? The officer licked his lips, uncertain. I don't know, sir. But our sensors are struggling to perceive it. It's almost like… He hesitated, then forced the words out. Like it's not really there. A silence stretched over the bridge. Torin's jaw clenched. That was impossible. Dominion scanning arrays were the most advanced in the known galaxy. They had mapped entire nebulae down to individual particles, detected enemy cloaking fields, across thousands of kilometers. And yet, this single ship defied their understanding of physics. A voice that drowned out the stars. Then, the ship spoke, not in words, not in a language, but in something else. Something primal, something ancient. It was a sound that should not exist, a deep resonance that bypassed the Dominion's comms entirely and pierced directly into their minds. Torin staggered. Across the bridge, his officers recoiled, pressing their hands to their skulls as the voice resonated within them. It was not speech. It was presence. A weight pressing down on their thoughts, a force brushing against their very being. It was as if the fabric of reality itself was whispering, bending, warping around this one human ship. And in that moment, Torin understood something terrible. This was not a human warship. It was something far worse. An impossible revelation. Torin's breathing slowed as he fought to regain control of his mind. He turned to the officers, who were still shaking off the effects of the voice. Recalibrate sensors. I want every possible scan on that ship, down to the atomic level. The crew scrambled to obey, hands flying across control panels, data streams, cascading across the displays. But the moment the scans returned, the entire command deck fell silent. Torin leaned forward, reading the results himself. His blood ran cold. That's not possible, one of the officers whispered. The ship was not made of metal. It was not made of anything known to the Dominion. It was something else, something that should not exist in this reality. And its power core? No fusion, reactor, no antimatter drive. It had no energy source at all. It was as if the ship itself was alive. And then, before Torin could issue another order, it moved. The Hunter awakens. The warship did not attack in any way the Dominion had prepared for. It did not unleash a barrage of torpedoes, did not fire kinetic projectiles, did not deploy any form of conventional weaponry. Instead, reality around it shifted. The space surrounding the human warship cracked, like a fragile layer of ice shattering over a vast ocean beneath. And then, one of the Dominion's dreadnoughts simply disappeared. No explosion, no debris, no warning. One moment, the massive battleship was there, a mountain of steel and destruction. The next, it was gone, erased from existence as if it had never been. The Dominion officers on the Tarkashan froze in horror. It hadn't been destroyed, it had been unmade. Torin's breath came in short, sharp bursts. This wasn't technology, this was something beyond it. And suddenly he understood why humanity had survived. They had not simply rebuilt their fleets, they had become something else, something the Dominion had no words for. Something that had returned not for survival, but for vengeance. Admiral Torin Valkorash had witnessed many battles in his long career. He had stood on the bridge of warships as planets burned beneath them, had led countless invasions, watched civilizations fall in their final, desperate moments. But never had he felt this kind of fear. The Dominion fleet, an armada powerful enough to erase star systems, was frozen, paralyzed, by something they could not understand. One moment, the human warship had glided through the void, silent, untouched by their firepower. The next, it had unmade a Dominion dreadnought without a trace. No explosion, no wreckage, no escape pods. The Vortian's wrath had simply ceased to exist, and now the entire fleet was on the brink of panic. the unseen terror. Find out what happened to the Vortian. Torin barked, his voice sharp, controlled, but only barely. The bridge officers scrambled, their fingers flying across the interfaces, desperately searching for answers. The massive, multi-kilometer flagship was the pride of the Dominion Navy, an apex predator among warships, and yet in an instant it had vanished. No warning, no energy spike, nothing. "Sir," one of the officers gasped, "it's not just the Vortian. We're losing sensor contact with 3 more ships." Torin whipped his head to the fleet display. Horror crept up his spine. The Tarkashan's tactical hologram projected the positions of every vessel in the Dominion fleet, or at least, it should have. But the markers were flickering, disappearing one by one. "We're losing ships without any impact readings," another officer choked. "They're just blinking out." That was impossible. Torin knew warfare. He knew battlefields. Ships did not simply vanish without any trace. There should have been escape pods, debris, radiation signatures, anything to explain it. Instead, it was as if space itself had swallowed them. And at the center of it all, that human warship drifted through the void like a predator stalking prey, untouched, unharmed, utterly beyond comprehension. A new type of war. "Can we re-establish contact?" Torin demanded. "Negative, sir. There's nothing to contact. They're gone." The words sent a chill through him. Gone. Not destroyed, not disabled. Just erased. For the first time in his life, Torin felt something foreign slithering into his mind, doubt. The Dominion was the apex of military supremacy, the uncontested ruler of war. Every species they had encountered, they had conquered. Every fleet that had opposed them had been reduced to drifting wreckage. But this was not a battle. This was something else. "Sir," another voice cut through the chaos. I don't think the ship is attacking." Torin's gaze snapped toward the officer. "Explain." The officer swallowed hard. "It's not firing weapons. It's not transmitting demands. It's not jamming our systems. It's just moving. And yet, every ship that drifted too close simply ceased to exist." Torin's hands curled into fists. If this was not an attack, then what was it? A test? A warning? Or something far worse? The sound of the abyss, and then, just as before, the ship spoke. Not through transmissions, not through comms, but through something else. Something unnatural. The Dominion fleet did not hear the voice. They felt it. It resonated through the very atoms of their ships, reverberated within their bones. It was not a voice in any language known to the Dominion. Yet somehow, every officer understood its meaning. And what they heard was not a threat. It was a revelation. A truth that should have been impossible. A whisper from the abyss that shattered the foundations of their reality. Torin's breath hitched. He gritted his teeth, forcing his mind to resist the invading presence. Across the bridge, officers staggered, some clutching their heads as if the voice itself was pressing against their skulls. "Sir," one of them gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. It's not human." The words struck the Admiral like a hammer. Not human. The Dominion had assumed this was some prototype ship, an experimental weapon that humanity had built in secret. That assumption had been their last comfort, their last rationalization. But if this was not human technology, then what in the void was it? The Dominion's greatest mistake. Torin forced himself to think, analyze, understand, survive. Their weapons had failed. Their shields were unraveling. Their ships were vanishing. They had entered this battle thinking they would eradicate humanity, once and for all. Instead, they had awakened something far worse. "Admiral," a voice rasped. It was his second in command, eyes wide with something Torin had never seen in him before. True terror. "We need to leave. Now." Torin exhaled. His pride, his fury, none of it mattered anymore. The Dominion could not win this fight. They had never stood a chance to begin with. But before he could issue the retreat order, the human warship, the entity, the anomaly, the thing that should not exist, moved again. And the Tarkashan's lights flickered and died. The bridge plunged into darkness, every console, every display. Silent. The Dominion's most powerful flagship had just lost all power in an instant. Torin's breath came, in short gasps. He turned toward the observation viewport. And there, beyond the cold, lifeless glass, the human warship was turning toward them. A terrible silence engulfed the Tarkashan. Admiral Torin Valkorash stood frozen on the bridge, his mind racing to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. The Dominion's flagship, the most advanced warship in the fleet, was now dead in space. The bridge was pitch black. The artificial lighting, the command consoles, even the emergency systems, everything was offline. A ship this size had redundancies built into redundancies. Even in the event of catastrophic failure, at least some of the systems should have remained functional. But this was something else. The Tarkashan had not been disabled. It had been silenced. And as the massive vessel drifted helplessly through the void, Torin knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were at the mercy of something they could not even begin to understand. The darkness that swallowed the fleet, the Dominion fleet, had entered this battle expecting a one-sided massacre. Now, it was they who were being erased. One by one, their warships flickered out of existence. The fleet displays, before they died, had shown the same impossible result. No debris, no wreckage, just void where warships had once been. The human warship was moving through the chaos without firing a single shot, yet its presence alone was enough to unravel the fleet's very existence. The Dominion had conquered worlds, shattered defenses, and subjugated entire species with the might of their navy. They had never encountered anything like this. Torin clenched his jaw. He had led fleets against rebellions, fought against insurgent colonies, crushed civilizations beneath the Dominion's rule. And yet, for the first time, he felt what those defeated civilizations must have felt when his fleet arrived above their skies. Powerless, a ship beyond comprehension. "Status report," Torin barked, forcing his voice to remain steady. A second passed, then another. The officers at their stations did not move. Some were frozen in shock. Others were frantically tapping dead consoles, desperate for a response that would never come. "The ship is completely unresponsive," one officer finally gasped, his voice hoarse. "All primary systems are offline. Communications are down. Power. Readings are gone." That last word sent a chill through the bridge. Not low. Not malfunctioning. Gone. Something had drained the ship of its very life force. Torin forced himself to think. The Tarkashan had backup systems. Even if the main reactors were compromised, there should have been auxiliary power reserves. Yet nothing remained. This was not an energy disruption. It was as if the warship had been stripped of the very concept of function, and at the center of it all, the human warship remained. The horror of the unknown, Admiral. A voice rasped in the darkness. Torin turned to see one of his senior officers, his second in command, a hardened veteran who had once laughed in the face of planetary annihilation. But now, his expression was one of pure terror. He was staring at something outside the viewport. Torin followed his gaze. The human warship was turning. No, not turning. It was focusing on them. The ship had no visible weapons, no standard hull plating, nothing that resembled Dominion or even known galactic warship design. And yet, Torin knew. It was looking at them. Something unseen. Something far, beyond technology, was gazing into the depths of their ship. His blood ran cold. "Admiral!" Another voice broke the silence, an officer clutching his temple, his breathing erratic. I can hear it." Torin's stomach twisted. Hear what? The officer looked up, his eyes wide, unfocused. "The ship. It's speaking." A murmur rippled through the bridge. Other officers stiffened. Some gasped. Others pressed their hands against their heads as if trying to block out some unbearable sound. Torin heard nothing, but he felt it. A presence, pressing against the edges of his mind. It was not speaking in words. It was transmitting something else, something deeper, something primal. It did not communicate through language. It did not need to, because the meaning of its message was undeniable. Absolute. Leave. a power that should not exist. Torin felt the weight of that single, unspoken command sink into his bones. This was not war. This was a lesson. Humanity had not deployed an armada to fight the Dominion. They had sent one ship, a vessel beyond reason, beyond technology, beyond anything that should have existed, and it had decided that the Dominion would not survive this encounter, not unless they obeyed. Torin's hands clenched into fists. Every fiber of his being screamed against the thought of retreat. The Dominion did not surrender. But this was not something they could fight. His second-in-command took a slow, shuddering breath. "Admiral, if we don't leave now, we won't be able to." Torin knew he was right. The Dominion's arrogance had brought them here. Their belief in superiority had led them to this moment. But if they did not retreat now, there would be no Dominion left to return to. And then, the ship moved again. Torin's breath caught in his throat. The Dominion had minutes, seconds, to decide their fate. And if they hesitated, there would be nothing left of them but silence in the void. Admiral Torin Valkoresh's mind was a battlefield of conflicting thoughts, all warring for dominance against a force he could neither see nor understand. His pride, his duty, and his fear coiled together like a tightening noose. The Dominion had never fled from battle. Never. But this was not a battle. It was an execution. The human warship had never fired a shot, and yet the Dominion's most powerful fleet was disintegrating, vanishing into nothingness like embers swept away by a cosmic wind. And now, the Tarkashan, the most formidable vessel in the Dominion Navy, lay powerless, stripped of its strength by an enemy that defied comprehension. Torin exhaled slowly. Around him, the bridge officers were trembling, their eyes darting to him, to the darkened consoles, and to the black abyss beyond the viewport, where the human warship waited. Something had changed. The ship had begun to move. It did not lurch forward with the crude propulsion systems of Dominion warships. It did not accelerate in bursts like known alien vessels. Instead, it shifted, an imperceptible motion that felt more like the space around. It was being rearranged rather than the ship itself moving, and as it did, something unseen pressed against the Tarkashan. A presence, an inevitability. Torin knew in that moment that they were no longer being ignored. They had been noticed. Deep, sickening pressure sank into his chest, an unnatural weight pressing against his thoughts. He had fought in hundreds of battles, stared down planetary bombardments, and watched fleets burn beneath his command. But this was the first time in his life he understood what it was like to be prey. The whisper in the void, a strangled cry, tore through the bridge. Torin turned sharply toward the source. One of his senior officers, Commander Relvok, was on his knees, gripping the sides of his head, his eyes wide with terror. His breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat dripped down, his brow as if he were enduring some unseen agony. Torin took a step forward. "Commander!" Relvok's eyes snapped up to meet his. The pupils had vanished. What remained was void, endless, depthless black, stretching beyond the limits of sanity. And then, he spoke. But the voice was not his own. "Your empire is an echo of the past. Your weapons are dust before the storm. Your arrogance is a mistake that will not be repeated." The words reverberated through the bridge, not through sound, but through something deeper, something that crawled beneath the skin, latching onto the very essence of those who heard it. Torin felt the weight of those words carve into his mind. He tried to resist, tried to hold on to his sense of self, but the presence was inside him now. It was not a voice. Not in the way living beings spoke. It was a certainty. A truth woven into the fabric of the universe itself. And in that truth, there was no space for defiance, only submission. A choice that was never theirs to make. The lights flickered. The darkness that had swallowed the Tarkashan shifted, not fading, not lifting, but adjusting, as if it had allowed them just enough breath to speak. Torin staggered back, wrenching his mind free from the unseen grip that had threatened to consume it. He turned toward his officers, forcing himself to focus. "Status." "Report!" he barked. His voice was hoarse, laced with a tension he could not suppress. A moment passed before one of the bridge technicians hesitantly replied, "Admiral, Auxiliary power is restoring itself. Torin's fingers clenched. Not restored. Not rebooted. Restoring itself. As if something was allowing it to return. The consoles flickered, weak and unstable but active. Readouts scrolled across the screens in broken fragments, chaotic and corrupted. But one thing was clear. The fleet was gone, not destroyed, not scattered, just gone. Hundreds of Dominion warships had vanished into nothingness, erased from existence without so much as a signal or a distress call. Only the Tarkashan remained, and the human warship was still there, waiting. Torin's breath came slow and measured. He knew what this was. A warning. Not a demand. Not a negotiation. A single, undeniable warning. The Dominion had come here expecting to conquer, to erase, to impose their rule upon a lesser species, and in return, they had been shown just how insignificant they truly were. Torin's jaw tightened. His pride clawed at him, screaming for him to fight back, to not bow to an enemy they did not even understand. But the warship beyond the viewport had left no doubt. There was no fight to be had, only a choice. One they had been given rather than one they had earned. Leave, or be erased. Retreat or annihilation. Silence stretched across the bridge, heavy and suffocating. And then, "Admiral," his second-in-command rasped, "if we stay here, we die." Torin closed his eyes. He already knew that. He turned toward the helm officer, his voice low, his command absolute. "Get us out of here." The officer hesitated for only a fraction of a second before his hands moved across the controls. The navigation systems flickered, erratically, struggling against the residual corruption left by the human ship's interference. But it worked. The engines roared to life, sputtering, damaged, but functional. The Tarkashan began to turn. Torin forced himself to look back at the viewport. The human warship remained motionless, watching, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment, for them to understand. The Tarkashan surged forward, escaping into the void, its crew haunted by the knowledge that they had not survived this battle. They had been allowed to leave, and that, above all else, was the most terrifying realization of all. The Tarkashan drifted in the vast expanse of space, its hull scarred, its systems barely holding together. The ship had retreated, but no one on board felt like they had escaped. Admiral Torin Valkorash stood motionless on the bridge, staring at the void where the human warship had been. The emptiness mocked him. It was still out there, somewhere, watching. Every breath felt heavier. The weight of the decision he had made, to flee, to retreat, to surrender without a battle, crushed him like a dying star collapsing inward. The Dominion had never run, not in 1,000 cycles. Yet here he was. "Admiral?" The voice of his second-in-command, Drekful, was hesitant, uncertain. It was the first time Torin had ever heard such weakness in the officer's voice. Torin exhaled, forcing himself to regain control. "Status?" Drekful swallowed. "Engines are stable but heavily damaged. Communications have been restored. Long-range sensors are partially functional." Torin turned slowly, his gaze piercing. "And the fleet?" The officer hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "Gone." Torin closed his eyes, his claws flexing against the armrest of his command chair. He had already known, but hearing it confirmed, it made the horror real. 100 warships, the might of an entire Dominion battle fleet, wiped from existence. No wreckage. No distress calls, not even the faintest trace of energy signatures. It was as if they had never existed. Torin clenched his fists. This was impossible. This was beyond war. The silence that crushed the soul. The bridge remained eerily quiet. No one spoke. No one dared to. Fear clawed at every officer, every crew member. They had witnessed something unnatural, a power beyond comprehension, a force that defied everything they had believed to be true. And the most terrifying part? The human warship had done nothing but exist. No weapons fired, no visible attack, no grand displays of destruction. It had simply been there, and the Dominion fleet had ceased to be. Torin's claws dug deeper into his palm. He forced himself to look away from the viewport, to tear his mind from the abyss of thoughts threatening to consume him. "We need to report this," he muttered. His voice was firm, but inside something twisted. Drekval hesitated. Torin turned sharply. "What is it?" The officer took a breath, as if steadying himself. "Admiral, what do we even say?" Torin's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Drekval meant. What words could possibly explain what had happened? How could they tell the Dominion, High Command, that they had faced a single human warship and lost an entire fleet without a battle? Would they even be believed, or worse? Would they be silenced for daring to speak such an unthinkable truth? The enemy no one was prepared for. The Dominion had conquered hundreds of species. They had burned worlds, crushed civilizations, erased enemies from history itself. And yet, this one human warship had shattered everything they knew about power. Torin turned toward the holo-display. He pulled up the sensor logs, scanning the limited data they had managed to collect. The readings were nonsense. The warship's structure was impossible, shifting between material states that should not exist. It had mass, but it also did not. Its energy levels fluctuated in ways that defied every law of physics the Dominion had studied for millennia. It was not just advanced technology. It was something else. Something terrifying. Something unknowable. Torin exhaled slowly, staring at the incomplete data. The Dominion had always believed itself superior. Always assumed that its enemies were merely lesser beings waiting to be conquered. But now, for the first time in Dominion history, they had encountered an enemy they could not defeat and, worse, an enemy that did not see them as a threat. The choice that would define the Empire. Torin took a step back from the console, his mind racing. What now? The logical course of action was to report their findings to High Command, to warn them of what they had faced. But would High Command listen? Or would they see Torin as a failure? Would they order another fleet? Would they send more ships to be erased, refusing to believe that the Dominion had finally encountered something beyond its control? Torin's stomach twisted. He could already hear the voices of the Dominion's ruling elite. "You ran from battle, Admiral? You fled from a single enemy warship. You disgraced the Dominion." They would not listen. They would see only weakness, and they would respond in the only way they knew how, with war, with more ships, more fleets, more lives thrown into the abyss, and the humans, or whatever force was behind that warship, would erase them, just like they had erased his fleet. Torin took a slow breath. His decision had already been made the moment he had given the order to retreat. But now, he had to decide something even greater. Would he warn the Dominion, or would he lie? To protect them from their own arrogance? Would he tell them that the battle was lost due to an accident? A navigational failure? A reactor breach? Would he bury the truth to prevent the Dominion from marching into annihilation? Torin closed his eyes. The weight of an empire rested on this choice, and deep down, he already knew what he had to do. He had fought for the Dominion his entire life. But today, he would betray it to save it. The bridge of the Tarkashan was silent, not the silence of discipline, nor the silence of respect. It was the kind of silence that followed an event too vast to comprehend. Admiral Torin Valkarash stood rigid, his claws gripping the edges of the console in front of him. The dim, flickering glow of the holodisplay cast deep shadows across his face, but nothing could hide the turmoil in his expression. He had always thought of himself as unbreakable, a product of Dominion warfare, a commander forged in endless battles, a warrior whose only purpose was to bring glory to the Empire. But today, he had to decide whether to betray that empire to save it. He stared at the incomplete sensor readings one last time. A single warship, not an armada, not a grand human battle fleet. Just one ship, and it had wiped an entire Dominion fleet from existence. The crew around him was motionless. Even the most hardened officers, the ones who had fought countless wars, conquered worlds, and burned civilizations to ash, stood frozen, not out of shock, out of pure, unfiltered terror. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to acknowledge the reality they had just witnessed. because to do so would be to admit something unthinkable. The Dominion was no longer the greatest power in the galaxy, a truth that could never be spoken. Torin exhaled slowly. His mind raced. He knew exactly how High Command would react. He could already hear their voices. You retreated from a single ship? Unacceptable. Deploy more fleets, crush them, wipe the humans from the stars. They would refuse to believe him. They would refuse to believe any of it. And in their arrogance, they would send another fleet, and another, until the Dominion ceased to exist. Torin's claws dug deeper into the cold metal of the console. His entire life he had been loyal. He had obeyed every order. He had led fleets into war without hesitation. But now the greatest act of loyalty might be treason. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the officers on the bridge. Some were staring at him, waiting. Others looked at the deck, unable to meet his eyes. They knew. They all knew. None of them wanted to send that report. None of them wanted to be the one to tell the Dominion that they had encountered something they could not defeat. Torin inhaled deeply. He turned to his second-in-command, Drekvol. His voice was calm, measured, controlled. The officer flinched, slightly, but straightened. Admiral, Torin's expression did not waver. What happened here today? Drekvol's jaw tightened. His claws twitched at his side. He knew exactly what Torin was asking. What happened here today? The truth, or the lie that would save the Dominion? Drekvol hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then, slowly, he straightened his shoulders. A navigational failure, he said, voice steady. A reactor breach. The fleet was lost in an accident. Torin let out a slow breath. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Drekvol turned toward the communication officer. Transmit the report to High Command. Keep it brief. The officer swallowed but obeyed. Torin turned away, looking back at the vast emptiness beyond the viewport. Somewhere out there, it was still watching. The human warship. It had let them leave. It had chosen to let them leave. Why? Did it know what they would do? Did it want them to lie? Torin exhaled slowly. It didn't matter. The Dominion had just survived an encounter with something beyond its understanding. And that alone changed everything. The shadows of war and the unseen. Future High Command would believe the report. They would accept the fabricated truth because it was easier than believing the impossible, for now. But what would happen when another Dominion fleet encountered the humans? Would they understand the warning hidden in this lie? Or would they force a war that could never be won? Torin closed his eyes. He had bought time, but time was not the same as salvation. He turned back to his officers. Set a course for Dominion space. Minimum energy signature. I don't want to draw attention. Drekvol hesitated. Admiral, what if High Command asks for more details? What if they question the lack of wreckage? The missing fleet? Torin's eyes darkened. Then we tell them what they want to hear. Drekvol exhaled. He gave a slow nod. Understood. The Tarkashan began to move. Slowly. Carefully. Torin did not look back. He did not need to. The warship was still out there, waiting in the darkness. Silent. Watching. And for the first time in his life, Admiral Torin Valkarash prayed that the Dominion would never see it again.